Thank you very much. And I am, like you, conscious of the time. My stomach is giving me strong indications, so I'll try to keep to some kind of schedule. But I do have some things to say that I hope will be useful. And it's great to have followed Prathama because I'm very interested in the issues that you present. And our program in Vancouver is pursuing a lot of those same things. And the intersection between what you're talking about in the so-called developing world and our world are very direct. For example, the business of it being the most expensive city in the world, while 60% of people can't afford housing, is actually starting to be reflected in the city of Vancouver in ways that I'll talk about. But I'm going to try to be organized. I have three basic ideas. The idea of the concentrated and dispersed city. That won't take too long. The bulk of it is about this idea of the flat city, which sounds disgusting, and people don't like that idea. Flat is a bad word, so it's a bit of a provocation. And then, hopefully with time, I'll end with a little help from Papa, and you'll see what that is all about. So, and Suzanne, if you'll give me a 5-minute warning. So the concentrated and the dispersed, it's been mentioned before, but we're in the middle of the largest shift in history. We have a shift from urban to rural, which is going on very rapidly. But not often mentioned, although it's obvious that it's concomitant, is the abandonment of the rural world throughout the globe. So Oklahoma, abandoned cities in Oklahoma, in Canada, in Russia even, in Asia, pretty much everywhere. So this is a world where the countryside is empty and the cities are bursting at the seams. It's a new city. Because the cities that are growing very haphazardly. I want to mention that I've been doing this work, not for 20 years, but for closer to 40 years. And in that time, I've been to maybe 40 conferences or more like this. And while it's great to convene with my fellow initiates in the religion of urbanism, we become, at least at my age, despondent that even though we're all saying the right things for decades, the cities are actually getting a lot worse as we go along. So I have a high degree of frustration at the end of my career about that. I hope to point to something at least a little bit uplifting, but I suspect those of you with gray hair like mine in the room might feel similarly. But in 2060, as been mentioned, there'll be 80% of all the world's people will live in cities. Again, Mumbai, an amazing city that I want to go to. But what's not often mentioned is that actually this is all happening at the same time that there's a global collapse in the birth rate. And that global collapse in the birth rate, when fertility globally starts to trend down towards 2, way below that in Europe and Canada, way above that in Africa, trending to that, it's at that or lower in China, trending to that in India, has huge significance to the creations of cities. And this is the world, the IMF map that shows that you see that sub-Saharan Africa is behind the curve, but Asia, Latin America are surprisingly already sort of very close to that magic 2 per woman number, which is mere replacement. And some places are incredibly low, like Singapore. It seems that the richer you get, the fewer babies you can afford. That's certainly true in my city. As the city gets richer, fewer and fewer people can find a home big enough to put their offspring in. So that seems to be the major factor. The decline in birth rate seems to correlate entirely with urbanization and the wealth associated with urbanization, but also the same stresses that have been mentioned. So the UN has what is the most likely scenario, the medium scenario, showing us peaking at 10 billion, and then, according to trend lines, going down. And that's all assuming that nothing else happens in the intervening 40 years. I think there's reason to suspect that some bad stuff can actually happen that might put another spanner in that particular projection. But there's one more thing to remember in all this before we get too far, with the exception of that little blip in the middle, which is quite a significant one, the 2008 so-called financial global meltdown. The more significant thing about this chart is the fall of the GNP across the world. The average GNP has gone from 4, traditionally we expect 4 per year, down to closer to 2. And why does that matter? It sounds like it might be a good thing. It's actually, according to this guy, a very bad thing, and it's curious that he'd be smiling at such a bad thing, because he says that with global interest rates or return on capital hovering consistently around 4 to 5%, and you only have 2% growth, that inevitably means, through simple fourth grade math, that all the money is going to be in the hands of people who have the 5% return. They have the stuff upon which they're getting that return, whether it's real estate, stocks, or land, or whatever, or just bonds. That's basically the only avenues for that return. All that money, in the absence of growth that exceeds that traditional return, goes into the hands of the 1%, or actually, more importantly, the 0.001% if you look at it more carefully. So that's the formula. And if you haven't read that book, you really should. Suzanne mentioned it yesterday. It just blew my mind, and it's a big part of what this framing attempt is all about. From that chart, it shows that, I guess this pointer may or may not, there it is. From that chart, it shows that the period where the middle class, that's us, basically. Anybody rich in the room? So the middle class, that's us, the bottom 90% controlled most of the wealth from the period of basically the end of World War II to the Reagan-Thatcher point, where neoliberalism comes in as a political strategy, which, again, you mentioned in Mumbai, it's dominant throughout the world. And what it has done, of course, is to mean that the collapse of the middle class and the increase of the top 1%, or in reality the top 10%, but in reality the top 1% commands 80% of that red line thing. So that's curious, and that is influential. Against that background, it appears that you have two different kinds of cities that are emerging. One is the concentrated city, and China is probably the paragon or the leader or the nightmare of the concentrated city strategy, where incredible planning power. It may be capitalist, it may be private enterprise, it may be government. It's usually a combination of both working together, have the capacity to pull off city designs such as this. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the dispersed. Some people call this favela, some people call this slums, some people call this self-built communities, but the more generic term I choose is the dispersed. It means that power is dispersed and initiative is dispersed to make these cities. Sometimes they're quite chaotic. They're certainly not master planned. And something like 2/3 or more of the future population is going to go into dispersed communities, not concentrated ones. And the concentrated seems to have to do with concentrations of power, state power, corporate power, planning power, while the dispersed, millions of individual decisions made without the guidance of the state and often against the guidance of that state. So they operate as two real extremes. In reality, you usually find a little bit or a lot of both in most cities. State usually controls at least some things. Individuals usually control at least some things. The American landscape appears to be a combination of both in many ways. So there's polarities that seem to apply. The concentrated and the dispersed are equivalent with big and small, global and local, master planned and incremental, policy-based and libertarian. Maybe you get a sense from my remarks so far, I'm more of a dispersed guy than a concentrated guy, which is strange for a guy who does master planned communities, but there you have it. What's curious, though, in my work around sustainable cities is most of the publications and the thought about this puts forward this model of sustainable utopia. And it's very much from the concentrated playbook. It requires relinquishing of individual personal power and control of the state to make it operate. And it has a high degree of techno-enthusiasm, if you will, that technology solar greenhouses on rooftops and whatever, all that green gizmo stuff will be the salvation. And I don't dismiss that entirely. But, and our city of Vancouver really is the model for that. It literally is representing that image in many ways, and we're trying to copy and emulate that. And calling ourselves the world's greenest cities, people in this room might be surprised to hear of our arrogance, but we've claimed that mantle, and I suppose if you're going to self-assess, you can give yourself the award if you like. But, when you look at it, what about this city as a model for sustainability? It turns out that it's a hell of a lot cheaper to build. This city here that we're looking at on the right costs, not counting the infrastructure to support it, which is largely subways these days, costs $800, or at least the purchase price for that is $800 a square foot, whereas on the left, purchase price for that model, in Medellin, Colombia, showing their incredibly interesting escalator project, their urban acupuncture project, the prices are nominally going to be way less than $30 a square foot to build that. It's probably closer to 10, but I feel safe at 30. And which is the better place to live? I'm kind of struck by the at least the physical similarities between the places we revere from our European tradition prior to the medieval period and before. Like the Greek village, mountain village shown on the left, and a view of Medellin, Colombia, very characteristic. Obviously, the scale of enterprise back in the day was a whole lot more minute in comparison, but the means of production and the degree of local control and individual control and organic connection to land in both of these cases is a lot more similar than the megacities in places like China. And it makes you wonder, how did great cities actually start in the first place anyway? This is a view of the 20th arrondissement as it emerged in the city of Paris. It looks tremendously different now, but it gives you a sense of the possibilities of these places organically growing out of those individual efforts that start to parcelize and streets become laid, and then gradually capital value builds up in those locations, which is the great thing about Medellin, Colombia, by the way, and many of the more functional favelas in the south. Has been the best avenue to get capital wealth for a very large number of people. And I also find it interesting that, at least for us in North America, this is not a question that's now solely applicable to what we used to call the third world or the developing world. It's applicable to our world, because our children can't afford to buy into any of the product that we're providing. It means that they're looking for alternatives, and the alternatives that they're actually finding look a lot like what's going on in other parts of the world in a way that we didn't acknowledge in previous generations, thinking that those parts of the world were entirely different. They're not anymore. So that leads me to part two of this discussion, which is the idea of the flat city. The attempt of the flat city idea is to kind of bring these notions together and to suggest a strategy that is, in my view, more sustainable than often the directions that we're talking about. Because when we start to look at that, I'm going to have to get a little water here. We can start to analyze that for some conclusions about which is better, a pointy city or a flat city. Places like Los Angeles and Vancouver increasingly, and a lot of North American cities, are pointing themselves towards a pointy city. I'll discuss what I mean by that, but what it really means in the abstract is parts of the metro region are important and they have high density. Other parts are very unimportant and have very low density. So it's a very uneven distribution of density across the region. That's the simplest way to think about it. Los Angeles is a pretty good example of the emergence of the pointy city with a really pathetic car share at 78%. So that's probably not the model, maybe unfairly chosen, but I hope you will agree with me by the end of this discussions. The bad ones are pointy, the good ones are flat. Like this one, Copenhagen has a walking, biking, transit share of 76%. broken down as you can see. Or this one, Amsterdam, walking, biking, transit share 73%. Interesting that walking is so low and biking is so high. You'll see dramatic differences in here, Copenhagen walking 10 and biking 30%. Whereas in Berlin, pretty much the same aggregate share, walking, biking, transit at 69, but walking is the predominant way of getting around. Or in Zurich, where again, walking is important, biking and transit less so. But significant thing here is that these three elements make up, biking, walking, transit, make up the lion's share of movement. And the characteristic feature of these cities is that they're flat, medium density over a very large area, and obviously a concomitant distribution of land uses so that the origins and destinations are typically much shorter than they are in North American cities, pointy cities. Or Bogota, 81, dramatically high bike, walk, transit share. The European ones are good to look at because they're not as much influenced by what you would expect to be kind of levels of wealth, but at least to see that South American cities are operating very much in this model of even densities over large areas. And this is probably the surprising part of this. At least for me, it was surprising to see this one. It turns out that in the flat city, transit's not the most important thing. You need transit, but it turns out that in the flat city, the two modes of walking and biking in various combinations in these examples are the most important element of the transit picture in the flat city. And the way movement occurs is mostly self-contained districts if you study the origins and destinations, connected usually by a tram network. And it's not hub and spoke, although it's often represented that way. Amsterdam. And Amsterdam, the tram system, which we all know and love, if we've been there, is really a walk extender. The basic trip is the walk and the bike, but the tram is the walk trip extender. So it's not really the tram, and it's not really density per se as an average across the region. It's that it's evenly distributed with land uses that are evenly distributed, that make districts much more self-contained and therefore aligned with the flat city model. Now in North America, we really worry about this stuff a lot. In Vancouver, it's become a religious statement that the higher the density, the better the sustainability. Therefore, anybody who has a problem with high-rises is an evil person, NIMBY person. So I've gone from being one of the good guys in the region to one of the bad guys as I've been sort of persuaded that the high-rise, which might have been good in the 80s when it housed a lot of middle-class people downtown and filling the schools down there and reversed the trend away from migration into rural, into the suburbs, into sprawl, that's changed quite a bit lately, at least in my mind, as you'll see. So this is an important graph for me because it shows pretty clearly the changes in transportation use, annual vehicle miles traveled as densities increase. And this chart is often shown to say density is great, let's have more of it. But more importantly is where you get the maximum benefit. You get the maximum benefit when you go from single-family sprawl to basically townhouse density at the 50 residential units per hectare level. And when you move beyond that, you don't get dramatic increases anymore in the sustainability of transportation. If you look at building energy uses, you find the same thing. That as you get to this density, in fact, the per capita consumption of energy actually goes up because the buildings perform miserably, typically. So let's talk a little for the remaining time about the problem of the high-rise and to make the argument that those of us who think this is the way to go, Hong Kong densities will save the planet, might not be exactly merited in their enthusiasm. The model of the high-rise is particularly difficult to integrate with the landscape, and often they're built increasingly in desert situations where you might get as much as 80 degrees Celsius variation in temperature. And I just saw today, by the way, on the television before I came over here, that engineers at the British Rail Company are going to have to go out there with screwdrivers and loosen up the tracks to let them expand because you've got uncharacteristic heat. And if you don't do that, the trains are going to fall off the rails. This is a great example of the expansion and contraction of building materials. And because the glass-skinned high-rise, which is so popular now, is basically a Lego kit or an erector set construction of various materials coming together that expand and contract at different rates, particularly glass and aluminum. What's really happening is these things are going like this all year. And the more temperature variations, say Toronto, for example, which also has an 80-degree difference, that you have, the quicker that's going to break down. So most of the research suggests that glass-skinned towers are going to fail, the skin's going to fail completely in about 20 years in situations like Toronto. And you can kind of get a feeling of why that is. That's got to be the worst imaginable way to put a wall on a building. I mean, the view is dramatic and you can stand there naked, which many of the people in Vancouver do, as kind of a thrill for each other, voyeuristic thrill. So I get it, I understand that, but in terms of saving the planet, you can't make that claim. Because these buildings here, they're designed exactly like an air-cooled engine, where the slabs from the buildings extend out without any thermal barrier whatsoever. Into the surrounding landscape, drawing the heat out of the building in the winter and also heating up the interior of the building in the summer. So it's a Frankenstein design that is perfectly imagined to be the most miserable energy performer possible. As you get up to the higher levels, the wind velocities are 4 or 5 times greater than in a normal neighborhood, so the convection losses are therefore 4 or 5 times greater. My architecture friends in the room will insist that we can do things about that. Yeah, at a cost you can make this thing perform, but when we look at the actual statistics in Vancouver, they're not. They're not. Okay, so I'm sorry, but they're just not. And we're building hundreds of these. Whereas this kind of wall, the lower the building, the less need there is for exposure of yourself to your neighbors, it appears. So you're happier with a more complete wall, such as this one. And then there's the issue, at least for us in Vancouver, of the dangers to these buildings of earthquake loss. We're very similar in our relationship to threat zones to Christchurch. And of course, they had a quake and they had a downtown with a lot of high rises, which, as has been mentioned, weren't the smartest idea in the first place, even from an occupancy perspective. But they have decided, oh, that was a bad idea. We had an earthquake. We're not going to build these anymore. So now they're going to do shorter and more green central business district buildings. Talk about barn door after the horses leave. But it's important. I was astonished about this. I said, well, we must have better building codes because our buildings are not going to fall down. So I inquired at the city hall, and they said, oh, we do have building codes that would protect the building against earthquake, but they protect it against catastrophic failure. It won't fall down in an earthquake. And none of the ones in Christchurch fell down. They just broke so badly they had to be torn down. And Vancouver, and probably everywhere else in the world in an earthquake zone, has the same codes. To make them so that they are absolutely resilient to an earthquake is apparently way too costly. It would make them economically no longer viable. I'm like, oh, that's great. So in the last couple of minutes, we'll talk about these things as a kind of cash box in the sky phenomenon. Increasingly, the high-rise in Vancouver, which used to house the middle class, is now no longer affordable by anybody in the middle class. And they have, this part is debated, but I'm of the group that believes that the attractiveness of Vancouver for international investment, mostly in the form of high-rises, has elevated the whole market such that the entire market is being drawn up into a position of unaffordability. It costs 10 times your annual income to get the entry-level house in Vancouver. It's supposed to cost 3 to 4 times. The other way to think about it, it would take your entire income 100% of your income, leaving nothing for food or anything else in order to purchase the entry-level home. So therefore, the millennial generation is out of luck. And the infuriating part of it is that a lot of this new construction, as much as 25% of the high-rises being built in Vancouver, are essentially unoccupied, and way over 50% are investor-owned. So it's the more you supply, it doesn't seem to reduce. The laws of supply and demand no longer seem to apply. But more important is, and basically in conclusion, is this idea of how does this fit into our regional thinking, this idea of flat and pointy fit into our regional thinking. Unfortunately, it doesn't. This is the plan for our region. The big black lines are conceived of as subway-type connections. And the dots are conceived of as very high-density centers at the 300 dwelling units an acre level or more. And this is what those places, these centers, look like. I won't polemicize them and explain exactly how unpleasant they have become, and for the most part. You can make up your own mind. But the reality is that our city, what this is being superimposed on is a city that looks like this, a city that emerged out of the streetcar era and that operated very well back in the day and still operates pretty well and could be reinforced if people were only thinking about it. But they're not. They're thinking about our region this way. We see this in map after map after map about, oh, how do we make our region great? Well, they have these, centers of biotech centers and industrial centers and education centers, and that's what this map shows. And the trick is to tie all this stuff together with a subway and everything's going to be great, which, again, importantly ignores that this is the actual fabric. And when you diagram how it's actually operating, which my students did, this is how it's actually operating. Do these bear any resemblance to each other? I don't think so, right? It's an entirely different way. The way you map the world is how the world is for you, and this is an important point. And it makes us make mistakes. In the city of Vancouver, we're going to put $3 billion into a hole in the ground. That's $250 million per kilometer, the most expensive infrastructure strategy in the country to go through a district that's only 15 dwelling units per acre. This is not the 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. And that's because they anticipate the continued aggregation of the city along these corridors so that we get the Arnold Schwarzenegger development along the corridors and then the anemia of everything elsewhere. You see that they assume that the minor arterials will not grow at all. So that's why they think this is a great idea, to spend $3 billion to do that, where if you took the same $3 billion and you chose a different technology, this one, the Siemens Combino tram car, you could have afforded to do something like that, just by way of comparison, to supply the whole city with a zero greenhouse gas mode of getting around. I'm sorry that you can't quite see the rail there. The slides don't quite fit, apparently. So, if you want a city like this, put in a subway in a North American condition like Vancouver. But if you don't, the city that works like this, you should figure out a way to work with that fabric and get to that magic density of around 50 dwelling units per hectare or 20 dwelling units per acre, 40 people per acre or 100 people per hectare. That seems, at least for North American cities, a sweet spot and something you could really do without changing the fabric of the community all that much. It's happening in very many parts of Vancouver on its own without much support. Our students did a project to see what that would look like, and while you can't really see the detail in this large map, it trended out to look like districts throughout the city that would look like that. I'm out of time? Yeah. All right. So in closing, I'll just say that I thank you for your attention, and a few more slides here show that this is not just confined to Vancouver, but rather the streetcar pattern of Toronto is interesting to compare to the walkability index. So the legacy of that pattern of absolute convenient access to transit within a walkable neighborhood that the streetcar provided for North American cities is still a legacy that we can capitalize on, and shows up in pretty much everywhere. That's the greenhouse gas map on the left for the New York metro area, and in association with the walkability map to showing the very close correlation between that pattern. Not too many people realize it, but New York, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens were very much streetcar city pattern for a very long time. That's a fact that's been kind of lost. So that's where I'll close, and I know you want lunch, so I'm going to leave it at that. And I appreciate that. My final section was going to be, so I'll just make mention of it. The illuminating and uplifting part of the last little while has been the Pope's Encyclical. And in this thing that I would have gotten to, imagine me trying to get through all that, are many of the key portions of it. You see that the thing has actually been written by an urbanist. And I'm not saying his text is way more sophisticated than ours. In some ways, it's less sophisticated than the things that we in this room have been working on throughout most of our lives. But it's really incredible that it's risen to the level of spiritual moral imperative. And I think that his discussion, which includes not just the issue of climate change, but how that connects to the challenges for the poor and our obligations for social and economic justice, and the dignity and quality of people's lives within their environments. And he specifically calls out neighborhoods and neighborhood control, and actually elevates places like the favela as in some ways a model, despite the desperation that's often felt there, is incredibly important, at least to me. I'm a lapsed Catholic and have been for at least 55 years, but I don't know, I might go back, because if the church is going to be urbanistic, then I'm all for it. And thank you.